On the edge of a forgotten town in Montana, where the snow bites and silence stretches for miles, an old military dog stood chained to a cold metal fence waiting for someone who might never come. He had served, sacrificed, and been discarded like broken gear. But what if one broken man could see the worth in another broken soul? Before we begin, let us know in the comments where in the world are you listening from. The wind rolled low and steady across the flatlands outside Havre, Montana, pressing down like a memory too heavy to lift. Snow clung to the rusted fencing and cracked concrete of a forgotten military surplus yard, where everything once useful had been boxed, labeled, and laid bare under the open sky. Among stacks of dented canteens, broken antennae, and surplus boots, there was one item unlike the rest, a German shepherd named Jax. He sat chained to a rusted post beside a supply trailer, his body still but alert. Jax was 6 years old, broad and muscled from years of working, though now leaner than he should have been. His coat, once gleaming black and tan like an officer's dress uniform, was dulled by dust and neglect. One ear stood sharp while the other, torn from a blast, drooped with permanent fatigue. A faint scar curved along his muzzle, and his back leg trembled slightly when he shifted weight. But it was his eyes, wide, amber, watchful, that told the story. They searched not for freedom, but for orders that would never come. Jax had served overseas as a mine detection dog, trained to walk ahead of men, nose to earth, listening for death buried in silence. On his final mission, the scent came too late. The explosion killed his handler and left Jax bruised, bloodied, and broken, not in body, but in instinct. He returned to the States marked unfit for further duty, not dangerous, just unreliable. The kind of label no soldier survives for long. Now he was part of a Saturday auction, one where most eyes skimmed past him to rifle stocks and rusted drone wings. A laminated sheet dangled from his post, scrawled with his ID, and a word that said everything: unsuitable. The crowd was mostly ranchers and scrapyard regulars, rugged men in canvas coats, with stiff fingers and tired eyes. One of them, a heavy-set man named Harold Pike, gave Jax a glance and grunted, "That mutt's half feral." Another chuckled, "Won't herd cattle if he's scared of wind." No one saw Jax's ears twitch when they spoke. No one noticed how he shifted into a submissive crouch as they passed, trained obedience that hadn't yet faded. Only one boy stopped. Kevin, 10 years old, tugged at his father's sleeve and pointed. "Dad," his eyes looked sad. His father, a lean mechanic with a permanent scowl and a voice dulled by too many bills, replied, "We don't need a broken dog," and walked on. Inside the office trailer, Staff Sergeant Dana Whitmore stood behind a fogged window, arms crossed over a clipboard she didn't want to finish. She'd overseen equipment redistribution for years, after serving 2 tours as a logistics officer. But something about this particular dog, the way he didn't bark, didn't pull, didn't hope, bothered her. She'd seen that same stillness in the faces of returning medics and mothers who no longer waited for letters, but rules were rules. If no bid came in by sunset, the clipboard would be signed, and Jax's chapter would end quietly. It was near closing when Elijah Brooks stepped into the lot. He hadn't come for anything, just needed parts for his wood stove, maybe a replacement headlamp. But his boots stopped short as he passed the fence. Jax looked up. No growl, no retreat. Just that haunted stare. Elijah froze. He was 58, tall, weathered, strong but slightly stooped, like someone used to bearing more than he could carry. His silver hair was cut short, jaw dark with a day's stubble, and his flannel shirt was buttoned to the throat despite the cold. His steel-gray eyes locked with Jax's, and for a moment, the noise of the auction fell away. Elijah didn't move toward the dog. He didn't need to. The recognition passed between them like static. Scars knew each other. Pain had its own language. Dana stepped outside with the clipboard, unsure why she even approached. No one's taken him, not even close. Elijah looked at her, then back at the dog. He a biter? Number just nervous. Me too. He reached into his coat, pulled out a pen. Dana didn't speak again. She handed over the form. Elijah signed with the calm finality of someone used to irreversible decisions. A few minutes later, the crowd had mostly dispersed. Elijah opened the passenger door of his pickup, looped a piece of rope gently through Jax's collar, and nodded. "Let's go." Jax hesitated, then climbed in. No fanfare, no second thoughts. Only a soldier, a dog, and a silence they both understood. The snow had thickened by midday, blanketing the roads out of Havre in a hush that swallowed even the hum of distant engines. Elijah Brooks turned off the highway onto a winding dirt road that twisted through the pines like an old memory. His truck bounced slightly over the frozen ruts, the worn tires cutting narrow paths into the white. Beside him in the passenger footwell, Jax lay curled into a tight ball, his broad chest rising in shallow, cautious breaths. He hadn't made a sound since Elijah loaded him into the cab, and Elijah hadn't spoken either. But something had shifted between them, quiet, fragile, not yet trust, but no longer fear. Elijah was a man shaped by war, solitude, and the silence that follows both. He stood over 6 feet tall, thick through the shoulders but slightly stooped, as if carrying more than just his own weight. His face was weathered, lined with time and grit, but his eyes steel gray, intent still scanned his surroundings like a soldier walking point. The scar across his forearm, mostly hidden by his flannel sleeve, was from the blast that killed his best friend, Paul Hensley, 8 years ago outside Fallujah. Elijah hadn't set foot in a city since. The forest had become his exile, his sanctuary, and his punishment all at once. The cabin came into view, nestled between 2 old fir trees that creaked when the wind changed. Built decades ago by Elijah's grandfather, it had no insulation and creaked at night, but it was the only place he could breathe. He parked the truck beneath the overhang, turned off the ignition, and sat still for a moment. "All right," he muttered, not expecting a response. "Let's see what kind of mess we've gotten ourselves into." Jax didn't move until Elijah opened the door. The dog's large frame hesitated at the edge of the seat, muscles tight, as if unsure whether this was rescue or transfer. Elijah reached into the glove box, pulled out an old knotted rope, and fashioned it into a makeshift leash. "Come on," he said gently, his voice low and even. "No more cages." The path to the front door was coated in snow, and Elijah kept his pace slow, giving the dog room. Jax sniffed the air, ears swiveling, but stayed close, never pulling, never straying. Inside, the cabin was sparse stone hearth, battered sofa, a single bed pushed into the corner. The smell of firewood and old coffee lingered in the air. Elijah tossed his jacket onto the back of a chair, knelt by the stove, and stoked the embers to life, while Jax stood at the threshold, tail low, body rigid. When Elijah turned and saw the dog hadn't moved, he said simply, "You don't owe me anything, but you're not going back out there. Door stays open. You choose." For several minutes, Jax remained in the doorway, scanning the shadows like a soldier checking for traps. Finally, he stepped forward. Not bold, not certain, but forward. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He rarely did. The wind rattled the window panes, and the fire cracked like distant gunshots. He sat in his old armchair with a half-empty cup of tea, watching the flickering light. Jax had curled up by the far wall, eyes never fully closed. At one point, Elijah whispered into the dark, "You're not the only one who lost someone." And though the dog didn't stir, his breathing slowed, as if he understood. The next morning, the storm had passed. Light filtered through the blinds in narrow bands. Elijah poured kibble into an old ceramic bowl, slid it across the floor, then brewed his coffee. Jax approached the food cautiously, ate without turning his back. Elijah watched him with quiet respect. "I don't know how long this lasts," he said aloud, "but you made it through the worst. That counts for something." Later that day, Elijah drove into town for supplies, leaving Jax behind. It wasn't a test, but when he returned and found the dog lying exactly where he'd left him, alert but calm, he felt something loosen in his chest. Not quite hope, but not despair. By week's end, they had a rhythm. Jax followed Elijah to the woodpile, waited while he split logs, watched him sand the handle of a half-finished carving. No commands, no expectations. just presence. Elijah hadn't spoken to another human for more than 10 minutes in years. Now he found himself saying things out loud, half sentences, memories, even jokes. Jax didn't answer, but he listened. And somehow, that was enough. What neither of them knew yet was that the past had not forgotten them, that the world had a way of pulling even the most broken things back into motion. But for now, in a cabin deep in the Montana woods, a man and a dog sat by the fire, two shadows stitched together, not by chance, but by something quieter recognition. The third morning in Elijah's cabin began with a low, distant rumble that seemed to roll out of the forest like the ghost of a memory. Jax stirred before Elijah did, his ears twitching toward the window as the wind picked up and the sky turned the color of wet ash. The snow had stopped overnight, but the cold stayed heavy in the air. Elijah, still half asleep beneath his wool blanket, opened his eyes just as the second rumble came, deeper this time, unmistakable. Thunder. Jax stood instantly, body rigid, tail tucked hard beneath him. He darted from the rug to the shadowy corner by the kitchen stove and crouched low, trembling. Elijah sat up slowly, his chest tight with the remnants of dreams he'd already started to forget. His t-shirt clung to him, soaked in sweat despite the cold. It was the same dream again, Paul's voice on the radio, then nothing but white noise and fire. They were both prisoners of sound. Elijah ran a hand through his graying hair and swung his legs to the floor. He didn't say anything at first. There wasn't much comfort in words when the body had already learned to flinch. He looked toward Jax, still huddled against the stove. The dog's amber eyes met his, full of a wild, silent apology. Elijah exhaled. "Yeah, I know, buddy, I know." The storm outside wasn't fierce, just persistent. The wind wrapped around the cabin like a shroud, shaking the shutters every few minutes. Elijah poured himself coffee from the enamel pot on the stove and took a slow sip, then crouched down a few feet from Jax. He didn't reach for him, just sat there in the cold, waiting. Eventually, Jax inched forward, not out of trust but need toward warmth, toward something not entirely hostile. The days that followed were a war of moments. One afternoon, Elijah stepped outside to chop wood, and the echo of the axe striking the log sent Jax into a frenzy. The dog bolted through the screen door and hid beneath the porch, growling and pacing. Elijah spent 45 minutes outside in the snow, talking softly through the cracks in the boards until Jax finally emerged, shaking. Inside, Elijah wasn't much better. He often woke gasping in the early hours, disoriented, fists clenched, convinced he was still under fire. He once knocked over a lamp in a panic, then sat on the floor next to the shards until sunrise, Jax lying beside him, not touching, just watching. Somehow, that made it easier to breathe. On the fifth day, Elijah tried something different. He cleared a space in the center of the room, sat cross-legged with a tin harmonica in hand, a relic from deployment, rarely touched. The tune he played was rough, uneven, but soft. Jax tilted his head at the sound, unsure. Elijah continued, eyes closed, as notes wandered through the cabin. It was music, imperfect and human. That night, for the first time, Jax fell asleep, not in a corner, but near Elijah's bed. By the end of the first week, they'd begun to move around each other like companions. Elijah would read aloud from old newspapers or mutter his grocery lists while Jax laid nearby, ears occasionally twitching. When a storm rolled in, Elijah lit the fire early and made space beside the hearth. Jax would creep close, still watchful, but drawn by the warm hand by the man who no longer expected perfection. On the 8th day, Elijah brought Jax to a nearby trail that wound through the woods. It was quiet, frozen under a sheet of pale light. Jax walked close, alert, eyes scanning the trees, but his tail began to loosen. Elijah noticed it, even smiled a little. "You don't have to fix everything today," he murmured. They passed no one on the trail, only deer prints and a fallen pine. Elijah stopped by a frozen stream, knelt, and scooped up a handful of snow. Jax sniffed the air and, for a moment, bounded ahead. Not far, just far enough to remind himself he still knew what it was to be free. That night, as wind whispered across the shingles and fire danced behind the stove grate, Jax rested with his head against Elijah's boot. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He simply reached down and placed a firm, steady hand on the dog's back. They stayed that way for hours, each offering the other what no one else could, a kind of broken safety. The snow had begun to melt along the edges of the pine trail, revealing patches of dark soil and frozen leaves underneath. It was early March in Montana, that quiet in-between season when the woods seemed to hold their breath, not yet spring but no longer deep winter. Elijah and Jax walked together, side by side now without the rope. The trail was familiar, winding along the ridgeline behind Elijah's cabin, and the stillness was comforting until it wasn't when. That day, the air was unusually sharp, and a gust of wind rustled the skeletal branches above. Jax paused, ears pricked forward, his nose twitching. Elijah noticed the sudden change in the dog's posture, the way his body stiffened, weight shifted back on his haunches. He'd learned to trust Jax's instincts, so he stopped too, scanning the forest ahead. "What is it, bud?" he whispered, his voice low and steady. Jax took a slow step forward, then another, before halting and letting out a sound. Elijah had never heard from Hema, short, sharp huff that sounded almost like warning. Elijah followed his line of sight, down to a half-buried metal plate glinting dully under the snowmelt. His chest tightened. He knew that shape, knew it from years ago, from another continent. It was an old anti-personnel training mine, probably forgotten from one of the National Guard's mountain exercises decades earlier. A rusted, sleeping death. Before Elijah could react, he shifted his foot, and that's when Jax lunged. The dog grabbed the cuff of his jeans in his teeth and yanked hard, growling low in his throat. Elijah stumbled backward and fell onto the frozen ground with a grunt. His heart pounded in his chest like a drumline. Snow soaked into his jeans and gloves as he stared at the thing he'd nearly stepped on. His breath caught. All at once, he was no longer in Montana. He was back in Fallujah. The sand was hot beneath him, his ears ringing, smoke curling into the orange sky. He heard Paul's voice calling out, then breaking off mid-sentence. The smell of blood and gasoline filled his nose. His fingers clenched the ground, but it wasn't sand, it was pine needles. His cabin, his trail. But the panic stayed. Jax whimpered nearby, ears pinned flat, his body low and trembling. Elijah turned toward him, eyes wide with a kind of pain that had no name. Jax was crouched as if expecting a blow, his body shaking not just from cold, but from fear of doing something wrong, of being punished. Elijah dropped the walking stick he hadn't even realized he was holding and crawled toward the dog on his knees. "No," he choked, voice raw. "No, no, no, you saved me, you did good, Jax." Jax didn't move. Elijah reached out, slowly, hands open and empty, and touched the dog's shoulders. Jax flinched, but didn't pull away. Elijah wrapped his arms around him then, burying his face in the thick fur behind Jax's neck. His shoulders shook as the tears came, silent at first, then ragged. "It's not your fault," he whispered, again and again, voice cracking. "It's not your fault." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The woods stood silent around them, the wind stilled, and only the sound of Elijah's breath and Jax's heartbeat filled the space between them. Jax leaned into the contact, slowly, tentatively, and laid his head against Elijah's chest. For the first time, he didn't tremble at human touch. He simply stayed. They sat like that until the cold began to bite again. Elijah finally stood and called in a shaky voice to local authorities to report the mine. An old ranger named Don Spencer, a lean man in his 70s with a white beard and a Stetson hat, arrived 2 hours later. He listened without judgment, took photos of the site, and muttered, "This whole area used to be crawling with training gear. You were lucky." Elijah nodded, but he wasn't thinking about luck. He was thinking about a dog who had saved him from 2 explosions, one underfoot and one inside his head. That night, back at the cabin, Elijah lit a fire and laid a new blanket by the hearth. Jax didn't hesitate. He settled onto it with a quiet sigh, eyes watching the flames. Elijah pulled his chair closer and sat without speaking, his fingers occasionally brushing the dog's back. In the flickering light, their shadows stretched long across the cabin wall stew, figures no longer fragmented, no longer afraid to be near each other. Something had shifted. Not all wounds had closed, but one had, and that was enough, for now. The snow had fallen steady for 2 days when Elijah finally decided to bring Jax into town. Supplies were running low, canned food, kerosene, salt for the front steps, and the storm forecast for the coming week didn't look forgiving. Havre was only 15 miles down the mountain, but in Montana winter, that could feel like 100. Elijah loaded Jax into the back seat of his truck, a padded blanket stretched across for comfort, and started the slow descent into town beneath a gray sky and gathering wind. Havre was the kind of place where people noticed everything and remembered even more. It had one grocery store, one gas station, and a main street lined with squat brick buildings that hadn't changed since the 70s. When Elijah pulled up in front of the general store and stepped out with Jax at his side, heads turned. Conversations stilled behind frosted windows. People peered through cafe glass and storefront displays with the cautious curiosity reserved for newcomers or worse. Known quantities returning from shadows. Jax walked closely beside Elijah, tail down but not tucked, ears scanning. The store bell jingled as they entered, and the warmth inside was immediate. A woman behind the counter paused her restocking and stared. Her name was Carol Dunning, a stout woman in her early 60s with cropped silver hair and sharp blue eyes. She wore a fleece vest over a flannel shirt and had run the store since her husband passed. Carol was known for being blunt but fair. She eyed Jax for a moment, then said, "That dog gonna bite anybody, Brooks?" Elijah's voice was even. "Only if they're carrying explosives." Carol snorted, returned to her shelf, but kept one eye on the dog. Other customers weren't so subtle. A man near the dairy cooler made an exaggerated circle around them. A woman with a toddler scooped up her child and whispered something under her breath. Jax didn't flinch. He kept his gaze forward, his stride matched to Elijah's steps, but Elijah felt each look like a needle. Near the register, a tall man with sunburned skin and a long scar down his left forearm stepped forward. His name was Trevor Hart, a former rancher-turned-truck mechanic who had once been mauled by a loose pit bull outside Great Falls. Trevor's fear of dogs had since curdled into something bitter. He pointed at Jax. "You're out of your damn mind bringing that thing into town," he said loud enough for the entire store to hear. "You know what these dogs are trained for? Killing. That's what you're keeping on a leash." Elijah met his eyes. "And yet I haven't let go." Trevor shook his head, muttered something about danger to the community, and walked out. No one stopped him. No one defended Elijah either. Back at the truck, Elijah sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine. He looked at Jax in the rearview mirror. "People see what they want to see," he said. Jax blinked slowly, then laid his head on the blanket, unbothered. That night, the storm came harder than expected. Winds howled through the canyon, power flickered across the valley, and radio broadcasts filled with warnings. Early the next morning, a call crackled across the local emergency channel. School bus number 17 hadn't returned from its rural route. Last reported on a mountain pass near Glacier Hollow. With no GPS and no cell signal in that stretch, rescue services were scrambling. The sheriff's office had snowmobiles on standby, but no clear location. Elijah heard the broadcast from the small radio in his kitchen. Jax was already at the door, ears alert, tail high. Elijah stared at him. "You smell something?" Jax gave a short bark, sharp, focused. Elijah grabbed his coat, flashlight, thermal gear, and rope. 15 minutes later, they were in the truck, wheels fighting the snow. They reached the base of the pass where the snowplows had stopped. Beyond that, the road was buried. Elijah got out, clipped a harness onto Jax and whispered, "Let's find them." The climb was brutal. The wind stung like glass, and the snow came sideways. Elijah stumbled more than once, but Jax led with purpose. His nose skimmed the wind, paws sinking into drifts, every muscle in his body tuned to the invisible. After an hour, he stopped, barked once, then veered off the trail into the trees. Elijah followed. There, buried under a thick curtain of snow and pine limbs, was the yellow roof of the bus. Elijah ran to the side, pounded on the door. A child's face appeared, tears and fogged up glass. "Help," the boy mouthed. The door was jammed. Elijah climbed through a broken emergency hatch and found 13 children inside, huddled in winter coats, 2 of them shivering uncontrollably. The driver, an elderly man named Hank Weber, had passed out from a blood pressure drop. Elijah radioed for rescue, gave their coordinates, and used the thermal blanket from his bag to cover the coldest child. Jax curled around them, sharing warmth. When the snowmobiles arrived an hour later, Elijah and Jax were already halfway through, calming the kids, telling stories between bites of granola bars and sips of melted snow. The next day, the Havre Herald's front page read, "Veteran and dog save local students in mountain storm." Trevor didn't say a word. Carol gave Elijah a nod when he came back in for more supplies, and no one crossed the street anymore when Jax passed by. The early spring sun cast long, golden rays across Havre's town square, where benches glistened with melting frost and children's laughter echoed between buildings. It was the town's annual Community Renewal Day, and for the first time in over a decade, Elijah Brooks stood among the crowd, not as a ghost in flannel, but as someone seen, someone wanted. He wore a worn denim jacket and a clean white shirt tucked neatly into his jeans. His silver hair was combed back, and though his shoulders remained slightly stooped, his eyes had softened. At his side was Jax, his black and tan coat shining in the sun, a red bandana tied gently around his neck. He looked every bit the legend whispered through Havre in the weeks since the rescue. A young girl named Lily Prescott, no older than 9, knelt in front of Jax, her blonde ponytail bouncing as she giggled. She had been one of the children trapped on the mountain bus. Her parents, Mark and Diane, stood nearby, both still visibly emotional. Diane, a petite woman with dark curls and kind, tired eyes, had baked 3 pies for Elijah. Mark, a broad-shouldered mechanic with oil-stained hands, had insisted on fixing Elijah's truck free of charge. Lily stroked Jax's head gently. "He's not scary," she said, looking up at Elijah. "He's the nicest dog I ever met." Elijah smiled, and it wasn't the half-smile of politeness or habit. It reached his eyes, carved faint crow's feet deeper into the corners of his face, and stayed. It was the kind of smile that hadn't touched him since Fallujah. Across the square, a table was set with flyers and a wooden sign hand-painted in navy blue and gold. Second Leash, Canine Reintegration Center. Beneath it, smaller words read, "Founded by Elijah Brooks." The idea had taken root after a conversation with Carol Dunning, the store owner, who had confessed one evening over coffee. "There's more Jaxes out there, Elijah. Dogs with no place to go, same as people who don't know what to do with them." Now the town council had granted Elijah a small tract of land behind the fire station, and construction of the first kennel had already begun. Behind the table sat Deputy Rachel Quinn, mid-30s, auburn hair in a ponytail and a face freckled by sun and wind. She had grown up in Havre, enlisted, served 2 tours as an MP, then returned home to keep the peace she once fought for overseas. Rachel had met Elijah during the storm rescue and had since become one of the program's first supporters. She stood up as Elijah approached, offering a clipboard. 3 applicants so far, all vets. One's even got a dog that's halfway through retirement training. She grinned. "Told you this would catch on." Elijah nodded, not out of modesty, but quiet gratitude. Jax leaned into his leg and let out a soft exhale. The mayor, Harold Bentona, short man with a heavy mustache and a habit of clearing his throat, too often took to the stage and tapped the microphone. "We gather today to recognize not just a brave dog, but the man who reminded us what it means to fight for something, even after the war is over." He gestured toward Elijah and Jax. Applause rose like wind through leaves, warm and full, and Jax lifted his head, ears forward, eyes alert but unafraid. A boy whistled. Another clapped and called, "Good boy, Jax." Elijah stepped up to the microphone reluctantly. He wasn't a man of speeches, but his voice, though rough with gravel and memory, carried. "This dog saved me more than once, not just on that mountain, not just from that mine. He reminded me what it is to trust again, to keep moving even when you're broken. We both came back from something, and we didn't think we deserved another chance. But this town gave us one." He looked down at Jax. Now we're going to make sure other dogs like him, dogs who served, who sacrificed, and were cast aside, get that same chance. As he stepped down, the crowd moved forward. Children reached out to pet Jax. Adults shook Elijah's hand. Even Trevor Hart, the rancher who once accused Jax of being dangerous, approached slowly. He was a tall man with hard lines etched into his face, but today those lines sagged with something close to humility. "I was wrong," Trevor said, voice low. "About the dog, about you." Elijah didn't say anything. He just held out his hand, and they shook once firm, quiet, done. Later that evening, long after the crowd had scattered and lights began to glow behind curtained windows, Elijah sat on his porch with a cup of tea and Jax resting at his feet. The wind was gentle, and the stars blinked softly above the tree line. In that silence, no longer haunted but whole, Elijah whispered, "You were never forgotten, were you?" Jax didn't answer, but he didn't need to. The answer was in every heartbeat that followed. Sometimes, healing doesn't come with grand gestures or loud applause. Sometimes, it's found in the quiet bond between a man and a dog, two souls discarded by the world who found strength in each other. Jax was never just a forgotten dog, and Elijah was never just a broken man. Together, they became living proof that no one is ever beyond redemption. All it takes is someone to believe. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and let us know where in the world you're listening from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes in second chances.